are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation. Paul quoted this verse in Romans 10:15 as part of his discussion about the relationship between preaching and faith. The good news affects the one announcing it as well as the hearers. And the commentary brings out how Isaiah is talking here about the feet. It just seems odd that you would mention someone's feet. I mean, why wouldn't you mention the face of the person giving this good news? But I kind of thought of it maybe, the feet, that's also the way we travel by feet. So it was a way, I think seeing someone, seeing a person, seeing that whole person, their feet included, all of this kind of probably played into the fact that it was news coming from a person, maybe. I think there's different ways to interpret it. But the message is beautiful. In the book of Isaiah, however, the verse has a more specific reference. It describes one announcing the good news of the return from Babylon exile to the homeland of Israel, and especially to Jerusalem. So good tidings, good news again. So this was just something wonderful for these people. They had been under Babylon exile for a number of years, and this was so good to hear that they were actually going to be able to go back to their homeland. Israelites will experience the end of their suffering as the hands of Babylonians in a way somewhat similar to the Exodus from Egypt, which happened hundreds of years earlier. The deliverance to come would or should lead to good ethical behavior, properly practiced. That behaviors will result in turn in social harmony and fairness. But that would happen only if people were to commit themselves to the message. So it's just a little insert here about a situation where a family was on a little boat and the boat capsized. And the mother went under and she came back up and she was looking for her other children, and she could see everybody but her one little girl. She couldn't see her, and her husband was diving under the boat like 3 times and he still couldn't find her. But someone else was close by and he dove under and he found the little girl and he brought her up and she was okay. So this was such great news, and it was that relief factor that I was talking about. Just like you're waiting on that test and you get good news, and this was a relief. So it's such a relief to this mother because she was so afraid that her little child had drowned, but the little girl was alive. So this was such great news for her. And there's much celebration when we share a message of hope, joy, and thanksgiving. That is true not only for the ones receiving the message, but also for the one bringing it. The man who was able to share this good news, that brought great comfort to him as well. Our lives could be so much more joyful were we to pray for opportunities to share the gospel that rescues people from eternal death. Do you pray for such opportunities? I think it's just encouraging us to always be able to look for that opportunity to share the good news of Jesus Christ as we go about our daily business, just to be able to look for those opportunities. Verse 7b, who say to Zion, your God reigns? God's rule over the cosmos was celebrated and affirmed. People who believe that God reigns live in hope and the time when all evils of the world will disappear and goodness will triumph. Zion is another designation for the city of Jerusalem, and we see that in various places throughout the Bible, the word Zion. And it talks about even the Hebrew poetry that they had written, repeated oftentimes the word Zion. Verse 8a, listen, your watchmen, lift up their voices. Together they shout for joy. So the prophet is now talking about the person that's kind of watching over everything, that watchman. Now he has good news too. So he's not giving the word that their city's being invaded. He's giving the word that it's good news. They're going to be able to travel back to Jerusalem, where they were exiled from for many years. So and the watchman would be shouting loudly. It's going to be exciting. There's so much excitement and joy in what's being said. Certain biblical texts refer to the prophets as watchmen also. So you might see that kind of intertwined there, watchmen or prophets. And in this case, Isaiah was the prophet, but could also be referred to a watchman. Instead of earlier prophets' messages of warning, criticisms that fell mostly on deaf ears, the prophets would lead with new news of celebrations in the era of the redemption. We note in passing that false prophets can be seen as false watchmen. So, there were times too where people were trying to share something that wasn't true. But in this case, this was good news and it was true. Everything was good about it. And verse 8b, when the Lord returns to Zion, they will see it with their own eyes. So it's going to be like a face-to-face thing. It's not just something that they hear about, oh, it might come to pass. No, this is like a true thing that's going to take place. They're going to be able to see it. They're going to hear what's being told to them. It's going to be a very special time where, whereas God has formerly abandoned Zion, things were to change when God returned and resumed full communion with the people. So this is going to be a really great time for them. Verse 9a, burst into songs of joy together, you ruins of Jerusalem. So we know that songs are often a way that we can share joy. And they said that there would definitely be songs of joy. It says the prophet Isaiah mentions also waste places. And that would be like deserts, wastelands, devastated areas, ruined cities. All of this is going to be rebuilt. The old Jerusalem was destroyed. And you had a lot of this deserted area, wastelands, that sort of thing. The rebuilding and repopulation of Jerusalem would turn the city into a place of celebration as the memory of God's saving work would come to the people's minds. So about 140 years would elapse between the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC and the rebuilding of the city's walls in about 445 BC. When that event came to pass, the people did indeed celebrate with singing in a grandiose ceremony. 9b, for the Lord has conformed his people, he has redeemed Jerusalem. So this is a comforting promise, the rebuilding of the city. Sheshbazar, I'm sorry, I might not be pronouncing that right. Okay, he was the one that led the first wave of returnees from Babylon back to Jerusalem in 538 BC, according to a decree by Cyrus, king of Persia. They began a start and stop process of rebuilding that lasted through the time of Nehemiah, almost a century later. And if you think about rebuilding and you think about what they had to build with back in these days, it took a long time. It wasn't something where they went in and rebuilt a city in a matter of a few months. I mean, it took years. It says it took over a century. So you're talking about, many days. So the people that were excited at this time probably did not live to see the full potential that the city would have, but they were excited for what their children would see also. In verse 10, the Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. So this is kind of an imagery. Of course, we know that God is not human, so normally you wouldn't see a human arm, but it's talking about, since God is spirit, he doesn't have a literal physical arm, but the figure of speech is marvelously useful in communicating information about God's authority, God's right to do something, God's right to change something. And the power, you think about the power. Most people, may feel that right arm is their strong feature. They're able to do a lot with that strong arm. I know even though I'm left-handed, my right arm is stronger because I could do a lot of things with either arm or hand, but I think it just kind of goes back to that thought of how you would normally be able to maybe lift something stronger or have that ability with that right arm. His arm, along with mention of his hand, occurs in several Old Testament texts that describes God's warfare against evil. So just thinking about God and how he is totally against evil and how he destroys evil. The empire met its end, and of course it's talking about the Babylonian Empire, in 539 BC at the hands of Cyrus, the Lord's chosen vessel. Working his will through human vessels seems to be God's preferred method, but if he cannot find that vessel, he will do it himself. So if we look too back at the phrase, in the sight of all nations and all the ends of the earth will see, that might cause us to wonder how widespread the knowledge of Israel's experience of deliverance could have been in the 6th century BC. But we know word traveled a lot by word of mouth. There were people that would just travel to and explain and give knowledge and stuff about what was going on from one city to another. So it says if the word did get out, there were trading routes, and sometimes that's the way word was spread. But in any case, it was all about that the word was getting out. There was going to be a new Jerusalem. It was going to be a great time. As in the previous verse, the prophet was less concerned with the timeline than he was regarding the final outcome and the people's response to it. Further, the imagery may also be intended as a type of depiction of the deliverance we have in Christ, since we are all to take the gospel of deliverance from sin to all nations. So it's also encouraging us to be that vessel to share that good news of Jesus Christ. 11a, depart, go out from there. The Apostle Paul quotes this verse in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 17. And there's also some other references in the Old Testament. The commandment to depart, go out from Babylon, reminds the reader of the Exodus from Egypt. Now, that was like 900 years before. And at that time, really in both of these cases, they were moving from a place of suffering to a much better place. 11b, touch no unclean things, come out from it and be pure, you who carry the articles of the Lord's house. So back in the day, if you read in the book of Leviticus, it specifically mentions chapters 11, chapters 13 through 15. They talk about things that were unclean, and the Israelites were not supposed to mention, or were not supposed to touch these things. Contact with such things rendered a person temporarily unable to participate in temple worship. Since the people would carry the temple articles back to Jerusalem, they needed to avoid anything other than absolute respect for those objects and the uses to which they would be put. The kings of Babylon had used these items for unholy purposes. Paul's own reference to uncleanliness points mainly to anything connected to idolatry, as does the wider context of today's passage. So it's possible that these things were used for maybe idolatry, they were used for unclean reasons, and when they came back into Jerusalem, that was not to be the case. They were supposed to be used completely for clean thoughts, clean ideas, and definitely no idolatry. The people, the objects in the entire city will become fit for the proper worship of God in rebuilding the temple. So when the Israelites received the good news of their pending return to their homeland, two departures were actually in view. One was the physical departure, and the other was the spiritual departure. The physical departure was going to be accompanied by a more important departure from sin. So it was really huge in that, yes, their physical bodies were going to be moving, but they were going to be moving away from a lot of the sin that they had been exposed to in this region. God has paid a high price to cleanse us spiritually so that we might return to Him for all eternity. And of course, we know that price was His Son, Jesus. Can you say firmly and decisively today that you are done with sin? I think that's a good question for all of us to ask ourselves. Verse 12, but you will not leave in haste or go in flight, for the Lord will go before you. The God of Israel will be your rear guard. So if you think back to the time where the children of Israel left Egypt, they were leaving hastily. You know, there was going to be an army behind them, so they had to leave very quickly. This was going to be a little bit different situation. It wasn't going to be a hasty flight. They could do more careful planning, and it's going to take place when everything was in place and ready, basically. Both cases, however, witness to God's protection. So we know that God was with those children of Israel. You know, He allowed that water to come in so that that army behind them drowned and or could not even pass into the water. Some of them, they were afraid to because they knew they would drown. However, whereas the first Exodus happened under a continued threat of cruel ruler, the second Exodus was to need no vigilance because the Babylonian Empire had collapsed. So it was going to be a much calmer move at that point. God's protection was there with them, though. The returnees would still need divine protection. And if you notice, it says the Lord is ahead of them, but He's also behind them, too. So He's in both places. That means He's surrounding them as they make that trip. He's completely surrounding them. So that had to be comforting for them to think about this move. Relief for God's suffering people of the 6th century BC foreshadowed the ultimate and eternal relief from suffering by that servant, Jesus Christ. So in conclusion, let's see how much time. Yep, almost done. For the ancient audience of Isaiah 52, the call to return home involved a literal physical movement from Babylonia to the land of Israel, more than 1,000 miles away. And when I was first reading it, I didn't really know how far this was, but 1,000 miles is a long way. You know, even in traveling in a car, that's a long way. And most of these were going, you know, they were definitely going to be traveling on foot. So this was probably going to be about a 4-month journey across the land. The greatest enemy of faith is often traced to a loss of hope. This week's text called on the people of Israel to reclaim their hope so that they could act in faith toward the God who sought their trust, their obedience, and their love. The temptation to despair undoubtedly remains strong, and that is not something one can simply will away. But by refreshing memories of God's saving action of the past, Isaiah's prophetic vision of the future could be believed and acted on. A renewed realization of God's presence is always in order. Several things had to happen, though, for that realization really to take root. So first of all, there had to be affirming the value of the messengers. And then there had to be some trusting of those messengers to do their jobs. And then 3, there had to be some accepting of the opportunity to transform the ruins, both physical and spiritual, into places of rejoicing. And then 4th, reintroducing of worship as God desires. All these foundational elements became reality as God set forth His plan of rescue. As such, these texts take a full circle view. And I'll just close with this verse, or it's not really a verse, it's just a thought to remember. Don't just celebrate the good news of the gospel, be its messenger. So I hope you all have a great week, and Thank you for coming out today.